Bueno, muy buenas tardes para quienes.
Well, good afternoon for everyone who is here with us from the American continent, and good evening to everyone who's here from Europe and Asia. For us, it's an honor to be able to enjoy the participation of different organizations and efforts that are with us today in this webinar called The Struggle of Peoples and the Emerging Situation in the United States. This is a webinar which has been organized in the context of a deep struggle for liberation by the peoples in the United States, but at the same time understanding the situation that is developing there. And this is something that's really very interesting, not just for all of the American continent, but also for the different peoples in this world that today are also struggling to really fully understand what's happening today in the United States, the struggles going on in the United States. And who best to comment on this than the different organizations that are engaged in the struggle right now? They are diverse organizations, but each is engaged to be able to get the greatest amount of rights and liberation for people in the United States. Today, I also have the honor of co-moderating this event with our compañero Bauman Assad from the U.S. Peace Council, who will share. But briefly, I just want to make sure that we all know that we're going to have interpretation into Spanish and into English. You can select the button to choose the language of your preference. And we hope to really have a successful webinar. And after each of our speakers is able to say their piece, we're going to move on to our question and answer period. And with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Bauman Assad.
Thank you, Gabriel. I would like to welcome everybody to this important gathering. It is an honor for us to have such a prominent list of speakers. As you know, the situation in the US is really getting to a very critical situation. And for decades, the neoliberal policies, the warmongering policies, imperialistic policies have led to a deepening crisis in the United States, expansion of poverty, class division, racial oppression, lack of healthcare, education, all kinds of problems that have been developing and deepening in the United States for decades have finally come to the surface, and the manifestation of that has been the election of Donald Trump, which brought all those conflicts and tensions to the surface. We are dealing now with a situation where the legitimacy of the state itself has come under question, and the institutions of the state themselves are being attacked. At the same time, at the level of society, divisions have caused such distance among the polar opposites that no middle of the road solution as it was in the past is possible. And that is why it seems to me that the two parties, ruling parties in the United States, are facing a deadlock in terms of managing the affairs of the country. Of course, this situation is very complicated, and arguments, counter-arguments, propaganda, counter-propaganda is being spread about fascism, about neoliberalism, about the freedom of speech controlled by corporations. All kinds of issues are coming to the fore. The lives of the minorities in the country and the people of color. All of these issues have caused such a complex situation that requires deep analysis, and it's not possible to do it in one setting, but at least we are hoping that this webinar that we have organized jointly with COSI-Venezuela will shed some light, and our speakers, who are mostly seasoned in the struggle will be able to at least give us some ideas about what we should expect and where we are going. Without any further ado, I would like to turn the microphone to Margaret Flowers, who will be speaking.
Thank you, Bauman and Gabrielle. It's an honor to be invited to speak with everyone today. So, as Bauman said, the United States is extremely polarized right now with far-right groups. Some of them are armed as militias, feeling empowered to demonstrate publicly and even threaten elected officials, as they have done in recent months at state capitals and in Washington, D.C. Law enforcement officers do little to contain them, and in some cases, even assist them. As we saw during the protests against police violence over the summer, there is a clear difference in how far-right protesters and people on the left, particularly people who are Black or brown, are treated by the police in the United States. Black and brown people are disproportionately victims of arrest, state violence, and incarceration. It is rare that police officers are held accountable for violence against and even murder of Black and brown people, which only emboldens them. A report from August 2020 called Hidden in Plain Sight: Racism, White Supremacy, and Far-Right Militancy in Law Enforcement finds the government has known about connections between law enforcement and white supremacist groups, as well as overt racism in the police force for years, but has not taken action to stop it. The report identifies white supremacists as the most lethal domestic terrorist threat to the United States. The conditions that have given rise to the current polarization are long-standing. The United States was founded and built on white supremacy through stolen land and wealth of the indigenous peoples, the American genocide that decimated them, and the forced labor of Africans. This continues today through the extraction of minerals on indigenous lands, including on sacred sites, conditions of extreme poverty on reservations, and policies that disadvantage Black and brown people in every way, leading to great disparities in health and wealth. In recent decades, wealth inequality and economic insecurity have grown. In 2010, 400 people in the United States had the same wealth as the bottom 50%. By 2017, 3 people had the same wealth as the bottom 50%. And in 2020, the top 1% of the population has 15 times the wealth of the bottom half of the population. When we look at wealth disparity by race, the median wealth of white people in 2016 was $150,000, while the median wealth for Black people was less than $4,000, and for Latino people, less than $7,000. And it's gotten worse since then. It is this economic insecurity that has been used by the wealthy class and capitalist political parties to sow division in the country. The Republicans blame immigrants for low employment and low wages, and they feed fear of Black people who are legitimately demanding an end to policies that threaten their lives and well-being. The Democrats speak the language of social justice, but make excuses for why they can't do anything to improve people's lives. They both parties, use distraction and division rather than speaking to the real causes underlying the crises we face: colonialism, racism, capitalism, imperialism, militarism. The failure of the capitalist parties to make material differences in people's lives led to widespread distrust of them. This opened the door for a figure such as Donald Trump to rise in power by calling out their failures and promising that he would hold them accountable. People were looking for something different and found Trump appealing because he was perceived as a political outsider who reassured white people that he would make America great again, which meant protect their interests. In fact, a new report on the presidential election found that Trump lost the election because of his mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic. The public perceived Biden as more trustworthy on the issue. But even though Biden won, President Trump received 10 million more votes in 2020 than he had in 2016. If changes are not made to reverse the wealth inequality and meet people's basic needs, the United States may find itself a more effective Trump figure as the president in the future. As others will describe, the Biden administration is not that different from the Trump administration and other recent presidents when it comes to domestic and foreign policies. Biden has been a longtime friend of the wealthy class and has dutifully served their interests for his long political career. He will make some small changes that will be treated as big changes, but mostly he will continue on the same political course. One particular struggle that I would like to now discuss is the struggle for healthcare in the United States. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed what many of us warned about for years and have tried to change, that the United States healthcare system, the most expensive in the world, is not designed to handle health emergencies like the pandemic. I want to paint a picture of the healthcare system in the United States because for people who live in countries where healthcare is treated as a human right or as a public good, it can be hard to believe how cruel the US healthcare system is. Healthcare in the United States started to change in the 1970s when the Nixon administration signed legislation that allowed healthcare to be treated as a profit-making venture. This was a decade after the passage of two large public healthcare systems, Medicaid for the poor and Medicare for the elderly, and both systems provide care to people with disabilities or chronic diseases. There was hope that these systems could expand to provide universal coverage, but the neoliberal assault on healthcare has weakened these systems and privatized most of the healthcare sector. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration's Department of Health and Human Services trained financial institutions in how to take on healthcare as a profit-making industry. I was in medical school at this time, and I clearly remember the push to consider medicine a business instead of a service. Now we find ourselves in a situation where this has been taken to the extreme and profit is more important than people's health. Since the mid-1970s, as the US population grew by more than 100 million people to 330 million people today, the number of hospital beds declined from 1.5 million to 925,000. Hospitals have been closing at an alarming rate, especially in rural areas and in poor urban communities. Private corporations buy up hospitals that are struggling financially and run them into bankruptcy, leaving rural communities without a hospital and without the jobs that that hospital provided. In cities where gentrification is happening, hospitals that served poor communities are being sold to developers to build luxury condominiums and retail space, which is more lucrative than a hospital. Private corporations also own and run medical practices. This has increased since the passage of the healthcare law in 2010, a law that transfers hundreds of billions of public dollars to the private sector every year. It's not unusual for a private corporation to own hospitals, medical clinics, laboratories, and long-term care facilities, as well as health insurance, which gives them a tremendous amount of power. In Baltimore, where I live, hospitals have closed essential programs such as obstetrics and pediatrics because they don't make money, and have opened surgical centers, and cardiovascular centers that do make profits. Doctors have been dropped from health insurance plans because they provide too much care for their patients, because health insurance corporations consider any monies spent on healthcare to be a loss that threatens their profits. In addition to the increase in privatization, there's been systematic disinvestment in the public health infrastructure, leaving health departments severely understaffed when the pandemic began. Even if there had been a president in power who had taken the pandemic seriously, the United States was not prepared to manage it. The healthcare system in the United States is very fragmented. There's no central coordination of it. There's little communication between the various parts of the system. This led to chaos early on as the different parts of the system struggled to get what they needed and competed with each other for the supplies that were available. The corporations that made essentials, such as protective gear and ventilators, raised their prices and put hospitals and states in a bidding war. Health professionals and hospital staff were left unprotected and were wearing garbage bags over their clothing. They reused their masks from day to day. In the beginning, there was little communication and sharing of information, leaving healthcare professionals in the dark about how best to treat their patients with this new coronavirus. The messages coming from the Centers for Disease Control were mixed and frequently changing. There were no directions from the federal government to stop the spread of the virus. States and counties within the states were allowed to determine their strategies on their own, which meant in some places the rules were more lenient than other areas, not based on science, but based on political ideology. One county might have one set of rules, and the county next to it would have another set of rules, and then people just went often to the areas where there were fewer rules so they could eat in restaurants or do their shopping in stores. This has helped to spread the virus. The pandemic also exposed the problems with affording health care. Most people who have private insurance in the United States must pay thousands of dollars out of pocket before their health benefits begin. This serves as a financial barrier that prevents people from seeking care when they are ill. And it can drive them into bankruptcy when they do go to the doctor or the hospital. This is an even greater barrier for people who don't have health insurance, which was about 30 million people before the pandemic, or about the population of Venezuela. But now, with so many people losing their jobs and health insurance as a result of that, the number of people without health insurance is likely 50 million or more. And the pandemic has exposed the severe racial disparities in health in the United States. COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities due to lack of access to testing and care, the inherent racism in our healthcare system that undertreats people of color, and the long-term impacts of racism on health. Polluting industries are more likely to be placed in Black and Brown communities. Black and Brown workers are forced to work in conditions that leave them unprotected. Black and Brown people in the United States are more likely to lose their jobs and lose their homes, also leaving them unprotected. A new study found that if there had been a national moratorium on evictions from March to November of last year, we would have avoided 1.2 million cases of COVID-19 and 164,000 deaths. In a way, the lack of healthcare, housing, and financial security is an economic war waged against the people inside of the United States. Congress could have put policies in place to stop evictions, to house and feed people, to cover healthcare, and to provide a monthly income. But instead, they passed laws that funneled more wealth to the top while making inadequate changes for the rest of the people. People have been struggling for a long time in the United States to achieve a national universal public healthcare system. We call it National Medicare for All. Support for National Medicare for All has grown since the start of the pandemic, with more than 70% of people, both conservatives and progressives, supporting it. Over 85% of Democratic voters support Medicare for all. However, the election of President Biden has made it more difficult to advocate for national Medicare for all. He openly opposes it, even going so far during his campaign to say that if Congress passed it, he would refuse to sign it into law. And now that the Democrats are in Congress, and now Democrats in Congress who have supported Medicare for all in the past are reluctant to do so because they don't want to challenge the president. Establishment nonprofit groups that have worked for Medicare for all are reluctant to pressure the Democrats to pass it because they don't want to lose access to lawmakers. They are giving political cover to the Democrats to backtrack on their support for Medicare for all. At a time when the pandemic and recession are making the need for Medicare for all imperative, there are more barriers coming mainly from our supposed allies. This leaves us in a difficult position, but our struggle will continue. We are working to build a movement outside of these established groups to make the demand for universal health care impossible to ignore. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Margaret, que nos ha hecho esta
Thank you so
exposición
much, Margaret, for your words. Very important and very detailed explanation of what's going on in the United States. Now we have the honor of inviting and presenting Joe Lombardo from the National Coalition United Against War, and today will share his words with us. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Can you hear me? Am I coming on? Okay. Well, as Gabrielle said, I'm the coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the questions of war and international politics. Joe Biden is now the new president of the United States. Trump is gone, and the majority of people in the US and throughout the world breathed a sigh of relief. But we must also be clear that on most issues, especially on foreign policy issues, there is little difference between the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. Both parties continue to vote for higher and higher military budgets. Biden was a proponent of the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars and all US military adventures during his political lifetime. His cabinet picks show he has no intention of changing. His pick for the State Department, Antony Blinken, told Congress that he is for tightening the US encirclement of China. And his pick for the Department of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is a career military general who commanded the US troops in Iraq and had to get special permission from Congress to become the defense secretary because the position is supposed to be held by a civilian. For Undersecretary of State, Biden nominated Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland is a Cold Warrior who has been a proponent of expanding NATO and further encircling Russia. She got her chance in 2013 and 2014 in Ukraine, where she helped design the coup that overthrew the elected government of Viktor Yanukovych. She helped design, you may remember her, Victoria Nuland was the one whose phone was hacked, and she was recorded picking Arseniy Yatsenuk to be the next president after the coup and saying, fuck the EU, because they wanted the Ukrainian boxer, Vitaly Klitschko, to be the next president instead. But of course, after the coup, change in countries that will not follow the dictates of Washington and Wall Street. It first vilifies the government, then imposes sanctions to cause harm. One of the key initiatives of the Obama administration, of which Biden was part, was the nuclear arms treaty with Iran called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Biden has not reinstated it after Trump unilaterally withdrew from the agreement. It was the US that broke the agreement, but Biden is demanding that Iran go back to the provisions of the now broken agreement, or he will not remove any sanctions or negotiate a new agreement with them. The sanctions on Iran and many countries, including sanctions on medical products, and are hampering their effort to fight the COVID virus. If Biden wants to be different than Trump with his COVID program, then he must lift the sanctions on vaccines, medicines, and medical equipment to all sanctioned countries. Today, the United States has its military in 172 countries. It has about 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. The US and NATO's military presence has continually expanded since the fall of the Soviet Union. The US promised the Soviets that it would not move NATO or US military bases into the former Warsaw Pact countries, the countries that were allied with the Soviet Union, or any of the former Soviet states. Yet today it is in 12 of these countries. US agreements and treaties seem to always be meant for others to follow, but not for the United States. The expansion of the US military and foreign bases and the growth of the military budget have always been and always will be bipartisan policies. This is because the US has only two parties that are given any chance of winning. US undemocratic election laws and the incredible high cost for a national election make it impossible for a third party to have any chance. Political parties represent class interests. The two US parties, the Democrats and Republicans, represent the interest of the US capitalist ruling class. They have some differences on how to achieve these interests, but the presence of this so-called two-party system ensures that only the interests of the US capitalist class will be represented in the elections. The corporate media, which is owned and operated by one or the other member or members of this class, ensures that only their interests are seen as legitimate. However, world capitalism, which is dominated by the US capitalist class, is in trouble. It needs to continually increase its rate of profits and therefore is pushed to expand outside the borders of the United States. This has been called the stage of imperialism. As the US seeks more markets, energy and other raw materials, and cheaper labor and fewer regulations to increase its profits, the military follows to make sure that no one stands in the way of its inherent greed. This is why the US has its military in 172 countries. It has nothing to do with spreading democracy or any humanitarian desires. We are the humanitarians, not them. The country with the second most foreign military bases is the UK. These are the remnants of their imperial past. And the country with the third greatest number of bases, foreign bases, is France, also left over from their imperial past. Both countries today are junior partners of the US in its exploits and in NATO. So the US military and the US foreign policy are not the ideas or policies of one party or another, or one president or another, but represent the class interest of the class that is in power, and their parties and their presidents do their bidding. To some extent, Trump was an outlier. He had his own interests and ideas, which laid bare the undemocratic nature of class rule in the United States. They alienated some US allies. It built a right-wing movement based upon white supremacy, anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant demagoguery, religious fanaticism, and to some extent, working class anger. The rulers would not have this, and so they got rid of him and chose Biden to run their government. So for them, with Biden, things are back to normal. That normal is war, racism, and attacks on the working class at home and abroad. But there are problems. The racism and white supremacy that the US was built on and has been exposed is also being opposed. COVID-19 has been a consciousness-raising experience for millions in the United States, as its market-based healthcare system has proven to be the wrong one to fight the virus, and the US is seen as doing worse than any other country. Pandemics, which people in the US thought happened only in Africa and Asia, not in the quote-unquote white USA, hit us harder than anywhere else and caused people to isolate in their homes, something that never happened in this country before. And on top of this, when people saw George Floyd, a Black man murdered by police on their TVs in front of their eyes, they rebelled. Despite the virus, millions came out in the streets in over 2,000 cities, towns, and villages throughout the country, and also inspired uprisings in many other countries around the world. COVID-19 has caused a major economic crisis that we are just beginning to feel. The massive stimulus packages, which are simply a transfer of wealth from working people to the obscenely wealthy, will not help in the long run. Right now, landlords are told they cannot throw people out if they can't pay their rents, but this will end. Many of the lost jobs will not come back. This is the situation that Biden finds the US in. Capitalism in its period of decline cannot solve the economic problems or the problem of racism or war. Biden has inherited an explosive situation. The progressive forces in the US must come together, we must organize, and we must be ready. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the great presentation. I would like to introduce Sara Flounders, one of the leaders of the Sanctions Kill, to speak on the subject. Thank you very much. Welcome, Sara.
Good afternoon and revolutionary greetings. It's an honor to participate today, and thanks to both COSI and to the Peace Council for organizing this event. In the US and worldwide, everyone wants to know what to expect from the new Biden presidency. And hope springs eternal. But is it hope based on people's struggles to change history? Or is it hope in some vague reform? Is it hope that either of the two major capitalist parties here in the capitalist and the imperialist center will change ruthless exploitation? We're in the midst of a global capitalist economic crisis, a real meltdown. And we're also in the midst of a global pandemic. In the United States, the highest in the world in infections and deaths. In the US so far, there is an inability to remedy, to address, to change either of these enormous crises. It's clearly getting worse, much worse. So how will US imperialism deal with this double crisis? What is Biden putting forth? There's great publicity about diversity. That's always important. There's lots of promises, lots of vague executive orders. Some of the worst Trump outrages will be rolled back. Yes, that's true. But armed militias, racist police, tens of thousands of intelligence agencies and surveillance remain. And who in Biden's new cabinet And what policies will they stand for? So let's look at it for Venezuela. The United States made an all-out effort to pull the country down, overturn the elected government, use the most extreme economic sanctions to prohibit the sale of oil and gold, rich resources, seize the assets, back to very open, flagrant coup effort. Venezuela can't use their own money to purchase food or medicine during this pandemic. Will that change under President Biden? This is a big question and challenge. But certainly the invitation of Carlos Vejero, the emissary of the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido, to attend the inauguration is a message. However, because Venezuela uses social mobilizations and education, even under US sanctions, it's doing far better than any neighboring country in Latin America. And that is a tremendous accomplishment that should be really recognized internationally. The discussion of a new ALBA vaccine bank and sending what kind of solidarity, thousands, 14,000, I think, individual oxygen tanks to the city of Manaus in Brazil. It's part of a humanitarian land convoy. So we can see the difference in what's possible, even in a sanctioned country, and what's happening here in the United States. Now, the Senate confirmation hearings for the Biden cabinet appointees are a sharp reminder to the world of continuing and very dangerous US war policies. The corporate media gave a lot of focus on Biden's promise to overturn former President Trump's policies. But we shouldn't forget, throughout his campaign, Biden promised to make no substantial change. And his foreign policy appointments certainly show that. Despite the media talk of justice, new policy, diversity, behind the scenes, the same old US militarist policies are being reinforced through Biden's cabinet choices and their direct ties to industry-funded think tanks and military contractors. Biden's cabinet nominations follow the failed policies of both Democrats and Republicans. There's no substantial difference, and it's ominous for the people of the US and for the people around the world. Let's look at the testimony of that war hawk, Anthony Blinken, nominated to serve as Secretary of State. It's one of many searing examples. In his testimony before Congress, he made it clear he's for expanding the imperialist war in Syria, saying the US is not doing enough. He's for unrelenting pressure on North Korea. This is a quote. And the cutoff of all resources. He's for an expanded deployment of missiles to surround and pressure China. And he's for new demands and continued sanctions on Iran. And he supports the continued effort to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela. Now, here's what Blinken said on sanctions. He said, we may need to look at how we more effectively target the sanctions we have now, so that regime enablers really feel the pain of these sanctions, really feel the pain. And he calls for better coordination with allied nations so that democracy can be restored. We know what that means in Venezuela. He also testified, let's look at what it will mean for the Palestinians. Our commitment to Israel, security is sacrosanct. Right-wing racist South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham called Blinken just an outstanding choice. Now, he was a former Deputy Secretary of State under Obama, and he is well known for the positions that he's taken But really, he is trading also his past government positions to get lucrative consulting jobs with military contractors. And that's the role he's played. He co-founded the West Exec Advisors. This is a secret consulting firm for military industries like Boeing, the major banks, investment firms, Bank of America, Blackstone. West Exec Advisors is called a shadow government in waiting for the former Obama administration officials, and it is absolutely tied to US military policy. West Exec partners are former government officials, military officers, and diplomats. They define themselves as strategic consultants, so they can avoid being called registered lobbyists for the military industry. Now, let's look at another West Exec Advisor board member, General Lloyd Austin. He was confirmed Secretary of Defense. He formerly served as a commander of US forces in Iraq, special forces in Syria, really a war criminal, in Afghanistan, Libya, also affiliated with West Exec Advisors, sitting on the board of Raytheon, the largest US weapons manufacturer, as a general. And his appointment required a special waiver because by US law, the Secretary of Defense is supposed to be a civilian. Now, let's look at Aval Haynes. She's confirmed as a Director of National Intelligence, also affiliated with the West Exec Advisors think tank. She's a former Deputy Director of the CIA, and what's most important was she headed the drone program. She helped to create the legal justification for targeted killings as normalized action within US foreign policy. And along with assassination by drone strikes, she supports US economic sanctions that attack the nutrition and health of entire civilian populations. So West Exec Advisors is loaded with former top Democratic national security, foreign policy officials. They're now part of Biden's transition teams. They serve as unofficial advisors. Many others are expecting to receive all sorts of ranks of Biden appointments. There are a variety of other think tanks. They're not just West Exec Advisors and strategic consulting firms, all very well funded. They exist in both the Republican and Democratic between government appointments. The role of these think tanks is to develop well-vetted, experienced staff who are on call to serve corporate power, both inside of government and out. These think tanks also vet and put on staff and pay very well their collaborators around the world, waiting to move them into position in regime change operations. They're very well paid for this. The US government, national security, and defense agencies contributed more than $1 billion to the 50 most influential US think tanks. Here's another one. Kathleen Hicks, Deputy Secretary of Defense. She is the CEO, Senior Vice President of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That's the most hawkish of the think tanks in Washington. It acts as an influence center for the giant military industries, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman. She opposes the drawdown of US troops anywhere, South Korea, Afghanistan, Syria. We could look at Kurt Campbell, chairman of the Asia Group. That's another think tank. He's been appointed to the newly created position, National Security Council Indo-Pacific Coordinator. Campbell is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and is considered the architect of Obama's pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia it's a provocative policy of repositioning US missile batteries, troops, aircraft carriers to encircle China, directly threaten the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, to coordinate sanctions and trade wars and destabilization programs from Hong Kong to Xinjiang. and his new role is to integrate that anti-China strategy. Victoria Nuland, which we've already discussed, is Undersecretary of State. She is part of a think tank set up by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, a real war criminal, who said that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children was worth it. That's the cost of US sanctions, and they know it, and they publicly declare it. Now, Nuland served in both the Bush-Cheney Republican administration and the Obama-Biden administration, and bragged that she helped to engineer the 2014 fascist coup that overthrew the elected government, and that she used $5 billion in funding from the National Endowment for Democracy. All of these appointees promoted US wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, all promote starvation sanctions on Venezuela, Korea, Iran, Zimbabwe, Palestine. All support US plans to reinforce NATO against Russia and to surround and threaten China militarily and economically. Within 24 hours of Biden's administration, a large convoy of US military-supported helicopter gunships headed into Syria from Iraq. That's not a good message. A convoy of 40 trucks loaded with weapons and logistical materials reinforced the illegal bases in the area and the sanctions that prevent rebuilding. This convoy movement in Syria, and also maneuvers of aircraft carriers the very next day in the South China Sea, and the invitation of Guaido's rep in Washington to the Biden administration, they all show that the Biden administration's rush to affirm an absolute commitment to no substantial change, to ruthlessly enforce US imperialist interests within the two-party system, a two-party system united in serving US capitalism. Now, we are stronger here when we're not deluded. It's true that every country must negotiate with this new incoming administration. We understand this, and we stand in full solidarity with every country under attack. At the same time, no delusions. We recognize that trillions of dollars for endless war leaves working people in the US holding empty promises, while they struggle and die in the surge of the COVID virus, in the grip of racist police, under collapsing infrastructure, of an economy in crisis. And this crisis spreads to the entire world. The trillions spent for war, for profit, could easily alleviate all of these crises and give health, housing, and hope to millions in the US of working and oppressed people. So let's fight for our future and the future of all humanity. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Sara, por tu exposición.
Thank you so much, Sara, for your words. And we remind all of the participants that we do have a Q&A session. So we are requesting questions. We are accepting questions. We've only gotten 3 so far. We'll continue with this webinar that is helping us go deeper into the current situation developing in the United States. We'd now like to invite an activist in social and political fighter in the United States who represents the Black Alliance for Peace, which is an organization that many of us know. Welcome, Ajamu. I'll pass the mic to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of the organizers who put this very important event together this afternoon. I say revolutionary greetings to everyone who was part of this conversation, especially our friends and comrades who are outside the borders of the settler colonial USA. My comments, I'm going to slightly alter them a little bit because I think it's important for us to talk about, as the subject matter of this event, to talk about the evolving and developing situation in the US in terms of how it relates to the war that is being waged by this state in alliance with its European colonial partners against all of us, who are confined in this prison house of nations in the US, who are colonized, who are members of the working class in this country, and all of the colonized and exploited peoples and nations around the world. We can't have any illusions, my friends, about what we're up against. As all of the speakers have laid out, it's quite clear that we should not expect any alteration, any fundamental alteration in the policies of this administration, this Biden administration, understanding the nature of this administration. As Margaret said, I think, many people in this country, had a sigh of relief at the defeat of Donald Trump. And of course, that can be seen as progressive. But for many people around the world, in particular people in the global South, there was no real sigh of relief, understanding that both of these imperialist parties are connected to and committed to the same fundamental agenda. And what is that agenda? To attempt to try to maintain and expand US global colonial capitalist hegemony. So there's no confusion by that. So basically all of the domestic conversation around the possibility of some progressive change on the part of the neoliberal right-wing Democrats, had no traction in many quarters outside of the US. And we have to embrace that and understand that, because what that means, my friends, is those of us in the US, we have to go beyond just the correct analysis. That we have the analysis, but we have to begin to talk about what do we do at the center of empire to assist in this global struggle. How do we take advantage of the strategic opportunities we have here at the center of empire to advance the interests of the colonized and working class people in this country, but even more importantly, the colonized and working class people of the world, in particular of the so-called global South. And we have to raise that question in that way, because for many of us, we understand that the changes that take place in this country, the ability of forces to galvanize themselves and to put pressure on this state, to that extent, we'll see progressive change in the world. Let me put that another way. The struggles of peoples, of colonized people around the world, they're really not going to be contingent on us. Okay, they're moving. What we have to do is understand what our responsibilities are in this country. Okay, so this country, this prison house of nation, this state that is a settler colonial state, what we have seen in the last few weeks since the election of Donald Trump should be instructive to all of us. Not just in terms of the kind of forces that have been unleashed and revealed with the more vicious right, the more cartoonish spectacles of right-wing forces, but we also have to be very clear about what we have seen with the response on the part of the state to that political movement and the moves that have been made to strengthen the national security state in order to deal with any kind of internal political opposition that the state might find itself confronted with. Now we have to say that because as we take on our responsibility in this country to build an alternative movement, to be in solidarity with all of the forces, all of the peoples, all of the movements in opposition to US and European colonialism, we have to understand the context in which we are operating in. Just like our friends and allies need to understand the context that they are operating in and the nature of this particular administration. So the repressive apparatus we see being strengthened today is an apparatus that has one main objective: to perpetuate itself, to maintain its power, to advance its interests. We understand that. Our friends and allies outside of this country need to understand also too, and I think they do, that same agenda, that same set of interests is operative outside of the borders of this country. We make the connection between the repressive apparatus in the US and the repressive agenda, the warmongering of the state globally. We make those connections so we can remind ourselves of our responsibilities, so we can be clear in terms of who our friends are and who our allies and potential allies might be. So this Biden administration is quite clear that its mission is, as they see it, to reassert US global leadership of the pan-European colonial capitalist project. Biden is an Atlanticist. That's a fancy word for saying he's a white supremacist. He is committed, like all of those forces, black and white, liberal, neoliberal forces, to the perpetuation of white power. When we talk about the colonial capitalist system, we are talking about basically structural, institutionalized white power. Make no mistake about that. So any kind of alterations of the relationship between the US and, for example, Venezuela, one must understand that the objective is not to make things better for the Bolivarian process in that country, but there's an angle for how they can advance their interests. We must be crystal clear about that. So my friends, this nation state that we are a part of, the objective conditions that we are facing in this country in many ways mirror conditions we see in other parts of the world. And that is the basis of our solidarity, the material and political basis of our solidarity. You've heard many of the speakers talk about some of the material conditions that we are facing. And I'm not going to go through all of those conditions, but we know that we have a serious economic contradictions as a result of the collapse, the veritable collapse of this economy. And for us who are part of the African people, the working class of this country, we never recovered from the collapse of the economy in 2007 and 2008. And now we're facing a more dire situation than even then, with this COVID situation that has intensified the internal contradictions and the problems we face as a people and as a working class. So, you know, we understand why there's a legitimation crisis. We understand, because we feel it every day, the material contradictions of this system. And we have no illusions about that. But what we also understand is this: our responsibility. And we raise this question of responsibility because, you know, we hear people talk about this right wing and the challenge that the authorities are facing with this right wing, and we see their responses. I just want to remind our friends that, you know, for many of us who have lived and live in this colonial project, this question of fascism is almost academic, because we understand, just like you understand in the colonized world, that it was colonial fascism that served as the basis for the erection of global racial capitalism, okay? Many of us say that this concern with fascism was important. We also understand this, that this word fascism that was systematized in the 1920s was basically, in a way, a word that captured what the kind of political conditions and practices when white people do certain things to other white people. You know, that's when we talk and hear about this word fascism. So we've got to understand that what we're facing today, in some ways, isn't really that unique. There's some particular historical uniqueness to it. But for those of us who are in the colonized world, we cannot get as excited as some other folks who will convince themselves they are facing something unique and something that requires a certain kind of mobilization that continues to see themselves at the center of the opposition. So what our task is, my friends, at this moment in history, is to continue to build effective relations of solidarity, to understand who our friends are, but even more importantly, who the enemy is. It is for us to continue to build those structures, understanding that we have the power to, in fact, transform ourselves and transform these conditions. We say to the people of Venezuela, we say to the people around the world that those of us in the Black Alliance for Peace, we are going to be as adamant in our opposition to this current administration as we were with the previous one. That we understand that until we're able to take power back from this global minority, that none of us will be free. So we say to everyone who can hear and see this program, that at this moment in history, on February 3rd, 2021, our collective task is to deepen our relationships, to build a new kind of movement. But we also say too, to all of our friends and our allies around the world, that we recognize that we have a unique responsibility at the center of empire, that we have to strengthen ourselves and to build a more effective movement. And we say that because we know that we have some decent forces here, but even when we look at the anti-war and anti-imperialist community in this country, sometimes it seems like some of our friends are more concerned with doing everything else but building a more effective anti-war and anti-imperialist opposition. We have to address that. So our task is to build a movement. Our task is to strengthen our ties. Our task is to understand the objective and subjective conditions we are facing today. And when we do that, when we understand those tasks, we'll be in a more advantageous place to build the kind of power we have to build to transform this world. So I thank you, my friends. I hope we have a chance to have a very vigorous conversation to talk about what we need to do in more detail. But we say, let's remember this process, peace process in Afghanistan. Let's remember why it's important for us to demilitarize police forces in the US and why we have to shut down AFRICOM and shut down all of these global command structures, close down these US bases and defeat the US imperialism. And the only way we do that is when we do it together. All power to the people.
Thank you, Ajamu, for your profound presentation. Now we're coming to our last speaker, but before I do that, I would like to mention that if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A part section, because if you put it in the chat part, it will get lost in the middle of all those messages. And that's one. After our final speaker speaks, then we will have our question and answer period. And that period will be moderated by my dear friend, Margaret Flowers. Now I would like to introduce to you Vijay Prashad. He does not need any introduction from Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. He has been one of the most vocal voices against imperialism around the world, and I'm sure he's going to continue on that here as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Baman. Thanks, Baman, from the US Peace Council, and Gabriel from COSI for inviting me to participate. It's great to go after Ajamu. You may know that his name Ajamu means he who fights for what he wants. And since he wants justice, all power to his arm. And I hope that you recognize in what he's saying the very truth. On this webinar is a dear friend of ours, Al Marder. Al just had a birthday. Al is approaching 100 years old, a long distance runner of justice and peace. Happy birthday, Al. And it's so great to have you on the webinar. I want to talk a little bit about especially China, but before coming to China, I want to offer a few thoughts about the wretchedness of the US ruling class. And before I get there, I want to say there was an old joke, you remember, about the Lone Ranger and Tonto riding somewhere in the American West. And at some point, they are surrounded by a group of Native Americans. And the Lone Ranger turns to Tonto and says, "Tonto, we are surrounded." And Tonto looks directly at the Lone Ranger and says, "What do you mean we?" Well, the attitude of the of Tonto toward the Lone Ranger has to be the attitude of people in countries like the United States of America. And indeed, people in the United States of America are fortunate that they have groups many of whose leaders spoke before me on this webinar. UNAC, United Against War. We had Sanctions Kill. We had the Black Alliance for Peace. There's also, of course, the Poor People's Movement, which has a program that includes a statement of ending the culture of war, popular resistance. These are platforms that people need to join. There is no way to advance the class struggle globally unless there is a revolutionary movement in the United States that's going to directly confront the wretched ruling class, which divides its loyalties, oscillates between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Unless people join and do the work of building a movement, these webinars are utterly useless. You have an analysis, that's fine. But having the right ideas is not enough. Ideas have to have material force behind them. That material force is provided by organizations. Organizations are strengthened when people are involved. Absent direct involvement, you have desolation. Absent direct involvement, you develop cynicism. You're unable to confront power with the kind of force it needs. So I'm pleading with people in the United States of America, join an organization, build a movement, put pressure against the wretched ruling class. Don't allow oneself to be deluded by the bi-party, two-party system, because this is how the ruling class essentially wants to frame politics. Our politics is a politics to transform the grammar of political alignments in the United States, to transform the way in which politics has been organized. You can't do that by having a good analysis. You can't do that by attending a good webinar. You can only do that by building organizations, building movements, building power to confront, as I said, this wretched ruling class. Why do I call this ruling class wretched? Let's not go back to the time of settler colonialism. A wretched ruling class has a wretched history which we know about. It goes back to the extermination, annihilation of an entire people of this continent, and then comes forward to the present day. Let's set aside the history, which many people know about, although not enough people know about it. Let's stay in the present. Let's stay right now. Let's stay at the period when Bill Clinton was the president and he pushed through a policy which, goes by the popular term globalization. Globalization is a real thing. I mean, United States manufacturing suffered not only from outsourcing, although that did have an impact in some sectors. Outsourcing does have an impact on some sectors, but from that period onwards, productivity of social labor increases in the United States, mechanization increases, organization of workers inside factories and inside workplaces increases. Employers begin to get smart and they do flex time and precariousness of labor and so on, using internet platforms as a way to better organize, the way labor is utilized. You see this with Uber and so on. Very sophisticated use of platforms to basically better organize labor, social labor. The gains of all this went directly to the small class of people who sit on top, that minority. Call it the 1%, 0.1%, whatever. Globalization did hollow out the country. Initially, globalization at the time of NAFTA hit directly the blue-collar working class, which had sustained a generation of union attacks. And whatever unions remained went into business unionism. Even good unions in the service sector decided, rather than go out and organize the informal sector, they went the other direction and began to fund the Democratic Party. I'm talking about SEIU and so on. Strategic errors in my mind. You organize the people, you don't give money to the Democratic Party. A real strategic error by these unions in the 1990s. At any rate, the working class took a big hit initially. And that working class, because it was so disorganized and with so few resources, was really demolished politically. When the second wave of globalization hit, that was the wave which hit the white collar, the business office park workers, people who were doing, business process work, various kinds of white collar, but middle class white collar jobs. When those started getting outsourced, what was called business processing outsourcing, BPO, it's that class that got hit that became the Tea Party. The first organized expression of actual anger, which had some support of this globalization period, victims of globalization, was this Tea Party. This is the base of Trump. It's a middle class, upper middle class group of people from certain states that were frustrated by the attack on their livelihood as a consequence of corporate power's ability to arbitrage the globe, to use the globe to their benefit. It's not like as if workers in India benefit when some, outsourcing shows up there. It's not like they benefit. It's the corporations that are benefiting, coming and going, both sides. But this political power did develop in the United States, and it went rightward very quickly. So the left response to globalization simply wasn't there. And the wretched ruling class had absolutely no answer to this social and economic crisis. All they could talk about, and you'll remember this from the Democratic Party statements, all they could talk about is entrepreneurship. Go and, get retooled, go back to school and so on. That's all they could talk about. Big corporations making enormous profits just tried to maintain monopoly power. They were not innovating. Apple stopped innovating a long time ago. The telecommunications companies, which benefited from the 1996 deregulation of telecommunications, stopped innovating. They sat on their monopoly technological advantages. They were quite satisfied collecting monopoly rents. Meanwhile, inside the United States, the condition for working class people eroded, black and brown mainly, eroded in this period. The ruling elites, wretched as they were, didn't really care. You had Occupy come up. Periodically, you have Black Lives Matter type movements come up, and you have to understand the class character of these movements. What was a young man doing in New York City selling loose cigarettes? Why was he doing that? He didn't have employment, decent jobs that allowed him to feed himself, those he loved, and so on. He's selling loose cigarettes. At least that was what they alleged. He was killed for that. He was killed because a working class man was trying to survive. What was a man doing in, I don't know, one of those cities where he goes and he's alleged to be putting a $20 counterfeit note? Alleged again. What are these people doing when they are killed by the police? Police doesn't need a reason to kill him, but this is as much a class attack as it is an attack on the lines of race, what is known as race. It's as much a class attack. And that's really significant. It's the black and brown working class whose destiny is out of the consideration by the wretched elite. The wretched elite don't want to recognize. They know it's against their interest to recognize the social and economic crisis. So they pretend the whole thing is a political issue. It's a legitimacy issue. You know, Trump is a lunatic. We need to save America. I mean, what is that? Or Trump saying, I'm coming here to save America. Neither is Trump trying to make America great again, whatever garbage that is, nor is Biden trying to, what is that phrase of his, bring back better or build back better? Also nonsensical. You see, they don't actually have an agenda for the working class people, the majority of people. They don't have a social and economic agenda. They're pretending that up here in the clouds, there's a political dispute taking place. But they don't consider the real agenda. That doesn't mean they're not moving the real economic agenda where it matters. And you see this war against China that the entire ruling class is prosecuting. Remember, this begins with Obama, begins with some ferocity with Obama, with his pivot to Asia, deepens with Trump, with his tariff trade war. And then, of course, it's not only Antony Blinken, it's Janet Yellen. Janet Yellen goes before her confirmation to be Treasury Secretary and says that China is cheating on technological improvements. This is nonsense. They're trying to utilize the Uyghurs. You know, when did America become the great defender of Muslims? This is the country that went to war in Iraq, continues to prosecute a war in Afghanistan. Suddenly they are defenders of the Muslims of Xinjiang province. It beggars belief when people accept the State Department's views. Suddenly the United States government wants to defend Hong Kong. Where were they defending Hong Kong when Hong Kong was under colonial rule until it was handed over by Chris Patten, who is the last governor of Hong Kong, a British imperialist, now writing on behalf of democratic rights in Hong Kong. It beggars belief that people take these people seriously. How did they become, you know, the defenders of Muslims, the defenders of democracy? It's nonsense. The real issue at play here was articulated by Janet Yellen. She didn't talk about Xinjiang or Hong Kong or any of this stuff, or Taiwan. She talked about the fact that the Chinese science and tech sector has leapfrogged beyond the US science and tech sector, especially in robotics, telecommunications, green technology, and so on. And they haven't done this by piracy. They've done this by very smart investments in these sectors. Unlike US telecommunications companies, which I said were basically content to collect their rents, monopoly rents. They were not investing for new developments and so on. They were not innovating. The Chinese government spent a lot of money in these sectors to innovate. Chinese private capital put a lot of money in there to innovate. United States firms, Silicon Valley, during the Trump period was largely silent on his trade war because they backed it. They may be liberals in various ways, but they backed Trump to the hilt. When the head of Apple went to see Trump, all he did was complain that Samsung, the South Korean company, was getting an advantage as a consequence of Trump's trade war. He didn't say stop the trade war. He said, go ahead, Trump, you're doing our work for us. For us, liberals in Silicon Valley, they want this war. Why do they want this war? Because they can't compete with China on commercial and economic grounds. Because they need extra economic assistance. They want to defeat China, not in the marketplace. They don't believe in the free market, but through force, by diplomatic power, by information war, in other words, by the hybrid war. What the United States government is prosecuting against China is not a war for democracy, a war for better currency management. It's none of that. That's just what they say. What they are actually doing is prosecuting a real dangerous, imminently dangerous military confrontation against China, because China's scientific and technological developments genuinely threaten the large multinational corporations domiciled in the United States of America. Take this conflict very, very seriously. The United States and its wretched ruling class is not above bringing us into a serious military confrontation with China. This is not a ruling class that has held back the military. This is a ruling class that backed the illegal war against Vietnam, backed the illegal war against Iraq, has backed the illegal blockade against Cuba, backed the illegal sanctions policy against 30+ countries, particularly against Venezuela, a criminal sanctions policy. You know, at this time when the Cuban doctors deserve the Nobel Prize, and I hope you'll go to the website Cuba Nobel, at this time when the Cuban doctors deserve the Nobel Prize, you have the United States government putting Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list. This is the wretchedness of the American ruling class. They are not above starting a catastrophic war, or at least some kind of military adventure against the People's Republic of China. People in the United States, even if we have the best analysis, will not be able to confront this wretched ruling class unless we build power. You can't build power unless you have movements. You cannot have movements unless you have organizations. You cannot build an organization unless people join them. Please get involved. Join any one of the organizations whose leaders have spoken on this webinar. Get involved. Build organizations, build movements, build power. Get rid of this wretched ruling class. Help save humanity from the most dangerous terrorist force on the planet, the United States government. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vijay, for those really excellent remarks, and to all of the panelists. See Ajamu's fist there. Go ahead, panelists are welcome to turn on their cameras. We're going to move to the Q&A section. And if you have a question, there is a Q&A icon that you can use at the bottom of the screen to type your question in. I'm going to start with a couple questions that are very specific, and whoever wants to answer, just unmute yourself and jump in there. But the first one actually follows what Vijay was just saying. Someone wants to know about the sanctions. Are sanctions actually acts of war? Who would like to respond? Sara?
Well, I will always speak to this because sanctions really are the most outrageous act of calculated war against a whole population. And it really is intended to target the sickest, the weakest, the infants, the elderly. That is its intention, and it's very well understood by the US. It's a way of also of weakening the government and cutting its ability to provide for the population. And it is used around the world. It's now 39 countries, a third of the world population is under a form of sanctions, so, US sanctions. There's also UN sanctions, which the US in turn enforces and is the one who's rammed every one of these sanctions through. So this is very much an act of war against a whole population, and it is only a country that has vast economic and dollar power can literally shut off even being able to do a swift banking transaction, a credit card, to buy or purchase anything. Every country that's sanctioned, you think it's just against one person, the head of state or whatever. No, a country, once they're under sanctions, every single transaction becomes a stranglehold. And that is very well understood by US rulers, but not well understood in the movement. We have by the way, a new campaign. So I'll just put it in here under sanctionskill.org, and you can find it at sanctionskill.org/petitions. And I do urge people to sign. Thousands of people have signed on, and I think everyone on this panel today is a part of the Sanctions Kill network. So,
did anybody else want to respond to that?
Yes, I would like to say it's nice to see Iraculus here from the World Peace Council. Good evening to you, Iraculus. Quite late for you. we brought out a book recently called Vivi Ramos, Venezuela versus Hybrid War, edited with Claudia de la Cruz and Manolo de los Santos. Highly recommend it. You can't finish this book and think that sanctions is not an act of war. It's an act of hybrid war. It's a very severe garroting of countries like Zimbabwe, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, a range of countries that face sanctions.
Thank you. Anyone else? I just wanted to quickly add that we have also another thing at sanctionskill.org. We have a new toolkit. It's a slideshow with a sample script, and it really teaches what the basics of sanctions are, the fact that they violate international laws, and connects them to the economic war at home and provides you with resources to take action. So that's the Sanctions Kill toolkit. You'll find it on the Sanctions Kill website. The next question is about Victoria Nuland, who, we talked about her role in Ukraine and the US-backed coup there. Someone is asking whether we think that she might be part of fomenting civil war within the United States, if she'll play a role in that. Any thoughts?
I think it's Ajamu. Yeah, I'm not going to get directly into that particular question, but I think it's important that we remind ourselves that trying to come to grips with the realities of these various administrations, we have to go beyond the personalities. It's important to know where some of these people may stand, but we have to really ground ourselves in what social forces that they actually represent. Victoria Nuland is part of the neocon movement in the United States. We saw, in my opinion, a ideological and political bridge that was established between the neocons and the traditional liberal interventionists under the Obama administration, so that now they've become almost indistinguishable. So these forces represent extreme right, dangerous elements. And the very fact that this Biden administration has found a place for her and these forces, like the Obama administration, is a indication of the character of this administration. Not so much in terms of whether or not they're good or bad or any of those kind of theological terms, but the interests that they represent. That these are forces that are fully committed to full spectrum dominance, who are under the illusion that they can reestablish US global hegemony, who are openly discussing the possibility of nuclear first strikes against the Chinese and even the Russians, who are fully intending to deploy intermediate range missiles in the Indo-Pacific command area. So these are dangerous forces that we behind and get them in office during the last election. So we've got to keep the eye on who these people really represent, the social forces, so that at some point we can stop being so easily manipulated. Over.
Thank you. And Joe, you wanted to follow up on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think Victoria Nuland is a despicable person. There are many despicable people in this government that don't care about the lives of millions and millions around the world. And she wants to push the Cold War with Russia and with China, wants to surround Russia. She has always been that. But I don't think the powers that be in this country, the ruling class, the people from the Democratic and Republican parties, I don't think any of them want to see a civil war at this particular time. I think in some sense, this is just my guess, they let Trump go to the extent that he went on January 6th so he could hang himself, because they wanted to get rid of Trump. They wanted to get back to their normal. I don't think their normal is going to work anymore. And I think there will be a lot of struggle that will go on in this country. And I think it's always dangerous when there's right-wing forces that have been unleashed like Trump did. The white supremacy and the anti-Muslim and anti-immigration sentiment that was expressed by these people has always been there, but it's just been under the surface. He opened it up. He gave it voice. He let them express it, and it's very, very dangerous. There's been a right-wing movement and a fascist movement that's been developing in many, many countries around the world. The reason is that the liberals and the social democrats and these people have no solutions. And so they look towards these right-wing solutions. They swing over to them, and then they swing the other way. And they say, well, maybe our problem is due to the immigrants that are coming into all these different countries. Usually they're coming in because of US policy in the Middle East or in Latin America or wherever it has to be. And so they build up their prejudice, or that it's a Black person or a Latino that's taking my job, and that's why I don't have a good. So it's always a danger, and we have to learn how to fight it. But the way to fight it is not by building the Democratic Party, because they will just do what has happened in other countries with similar forces. They will not solve the problems that are underlying the anger that leads to this thing. It has to be an independent left that builds a movement that can take that anger and move it into the kind of forces that can make the kind of changes that we need. And in today's world, that can only be anti-capitalist. That must be against the system that is causing building the right wing and causing the problems that people are reacting to.
Here's a very quick question for you, Vijay. How to get your book, The Veremos?
Oh, well, you can get the book from international publishers as a hard copy, and you can get the ebook from Leftward Books in New Delhi.
Great, thank you. So a couple questions that are kind of related. One was about whether it's possible to convince conservative-minded people that the war on terror is bad for them. And the other one was more about how people are currently struggling just to, live their daily lives. How do we convince people that wars are an important issue that's directly impacting them, as they, are so focused on keeping their housing and food that are not really maybe paying attention to war? Anybody want to take? Go ahead, Vijay.
Well, I'll try. I would say that any of these organizations that I mentioned, whether it's the Black Alliance for Peace or you go to the Poor People's Campaign, have documents which you can read. Everybody has a similar analysis. The United States government, and I've said this many times, no government should be measured based on its constitution. Because basically, the Constitution is always a super document. Not always. Remember, the US Constitution had this 3/5 business and so on. At any rate, constitutions generally are pretty high-minded. You actually judge a government not by its constitution, by its budget. If you look at the budget, you can really judge a government. The US budget is extraordinary. Look, people say $700 billion goes towards the military. This is a nonsense number. It's closer to $1 trillion. Because you got to add in the CIA, you got to add in defense intelligence, you got to add in the National Security Council, it's NSA, National Security Agency. You add them all, it's $1 trillion. You're spending $1 trillion on the repressive apparatus. You add then the police forces from one range up to the other. You add all these repressive forces, it's over $1 trillion. Now, if you're a capitalist, very simple thing, business school first year student is asked, what you invest is what you put in, what you get out is your profit. Your profit should be greater than your investment. In other words, there's a rate of return on the investment. The US public is footing the bill for the down payment of this repression, but is not getting a good rate of return on its investment. It's a public investment and a private return. So the US population with its tax money is financing the military, financing the police, and so on. But it's private corporate elites that get the benefit. I mean, it's nuts system. You have public financing of the repressive apparatus and private gain from all that. So what more analysis is necessary? You know, as I said earlier, this is a pretty commonsensical thing. The ordinary people are funding something that doesn't actually get them a rate of return on their investment. You need healthcare. You know, in China right now, they have a policy called 2 guarantees. You know, you're guaranteed not to be hungry and not to be without clothes. And then there are the 3 things they insure: education, healthcare, and housing. I mean, imagine if you got these 2 guarantees and these 3 necessities. You know, that's what your taxes should go towards, not a repressive apparatus that you publicly finance for private accumulation by minority. So that's what I'm saying. You got to get involved to change this. I mean, you got to change the budgeting practice of the country. What do you have so-called representatives for? The House of Representatives. You have so-called representatives who don't represent you. They don't represent you, and yet you keep sending them to represent you, but they don't represent you. It's a definition of insanity, fellas.
Thank you. Go ahead.
What Vijay is also pointing to is the political challenge. The fact of the matter is we have opportunities to move politics in a different direction, but because of the weakness of our organizations, and the weaknesses of some of our cadre, we're not in a position to take advantage of the fact that, for example, majorities of the people in the U.S. are opposed to military spending at this level. But because we live in we don't have a democracy, those views are not taken into account. So we have to, it goes back again and again. It might sound like a cliche, but it's really fundamental. We've got to build more effective alternative organizations. We've got to recognize that we are in fact in the battle of ideals, that the terrain of consciousness is where we have to operate. We've got to understand that basically, we have an opportunity, especially as more and more people are being radicalized by their everyday life, their everyday experiences. They're seeing that their lives mean nothing when they are forced to go to work with no PPE. When they read about or hear about that their European counterparts during the pandemic are able to get 70 or 80% of their salaries while they can stay home. But in the US, we're forced to go to work and we get a lousy $2,000 and then another promise for $2,000 that got reduced to $1,400. And we're supposed to be happy about that. We have all kinds of opportunities, but we've got to understand the political challenges. We say from our point of view, as African revolutionaries, we want and seek solidarity with everyone. And we are encouraged and heartened by people who are in solidarity with us. But in my tradition, we've always had to remind our white allies also that they had a responsibility, and have a responsibility, to organize also some of these crazy white folks, to organize this white working class that's confused and that no one was talking to them for decades except for the radical right. Okay, there are all kinds of opportunities there if you have people who have the cultural and political competency to basically engage those forces. And we have to sooner or later, because if you follow the political discourse among those elements, if you just would have followed some of those Trump rallies and watched closely what they were talking about in places like Fox News, you will understand the kinds of political connections they are making. There's some real fascistic elements there in that political discourse, okay? Now, they were disorganized up till now, and they're gonna get organized. But the messages were some compelling messages against the political and economic elites, you know? And there's no counter to that besides the insufferable elitist BS you'll see at CNN and MSNBC. They can't relate to those freaks. They can't speak the language of the people. So we've got to have better organizers who can speak to those sectors. And we got to do this pretty quickly, folks, because the real possibility now of a really galvanized ultra-right movement, I think is more likely than it was a few years ago. Now, you know, I'm concerned, and many of you all have seen some of our statements. I'm concerned about both elements of the right, this ultra disorganized right and the neoliberal fascistic right that is still in power, that's still in the state, that is in alignment with other elements of the state, the corporate media, big tech, the military industrial complex, the intelligence agencies. I'm concerned about that form of unique US fascism also. So we have a tremendous task ahead of us. Very, very complicated situation we're facing in this country.
Sarah, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, it really has a lot to do with expanding our definition, our understanding of war in regard to the question. And I wanted to connect it also to what Vijay was raising about the changes in the US working class that we need to be acutely aware of. We have to address that there is a real war right here at home. And if we're not addressing it and linking to it in very concrete ways, it's an abstraction. We're fighting wars over there. No, we got to link it to what is going on right here in terms of a deepening poverty, in terms of the most repressive state institutions in the world that are right here and the largest prison population. But we also have to think how, even as the anti-war movement, we link to big organizing and important organizing drives that are going on here. I want to raise the Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, which are thousands of workers, 5,000 workers. Now, Amazon is the biggest employer globally, and they've hired almost 500,000 workers just in the last year. They have about 1.5 million workers now. And a worker in Amazon makes as much in a year as Jeff Bezos makes in 1 second. 1 second. So the rate of exploitation is so enormous, the rate of grievances. It would be tremendous for us to really think, when there's an organizing drive like this, how we build support. Don't let it get isolated. Reach out to all kinds of layers. That makes a real difference in how other workers identify. Is their only hope going to be to run to the Democratic Party, or can they rely on other forces coming in support and solidarity? So I think we have to think in new ways, talking about the corporate war on people right here. And a lot of that has to do also, Margaret, so much with what you raised and what's happened to healthcare in the US. There's no healthcare at all. The infrastructure has been totally hollowed out. So it's a real war that we're engaged in just for what we need right here. And the more we expand the definition of this, even in people's own minds, I think it will become clearer the importance of taking sides. Now we're trying to do the same thing on the international level with sanctions, expanding people's understanding that it's not just the dropping of bombs, it is the economic strangulation of people here and people around the world, and trying to find ways of showing real solidarity. So I would encourage people in the right now to look at Bessemer, Alabama, and this very important organizing drive of Amazon workers to build a union. Let's figure out how to support that, but do it consciously with all kinds of getting others involved.
Thank you. And I did put a link in the chat. The U.S. Peace Council has a campaign about moving money from the military budget to human needs. It's called moneyforhumanneeds.org. And it's a local effort that you can make through your city or county council to pass these resolutions. So check that out. It has tools on how to do that. That's something concrete that people can do locally. So another question was about the surveillance state, the police state. What are concrete things that people in the United States can be doing to try to resist this?
If I could just real quickly, just remind folks that, yeah, we have to resist the police state, and we have to connect that to the military war posturing of the U.S. globally also. One of the initiatives that Joe Biden talked about to prove his commitment to racial justice last week was he is going to reverse the reversal made by Donald Trump to the Department of Defense 1033 program. That program is a program primarily responsible for militarizing police forces across the country for the last few decades. A program that expanded under every president, but its most dramatic expansion was under the Obama administration. Now, Obama made some cosmetic changes to the program because after people were freaked out by the images of tanks and all kinds of military equipment in response to the rebellion in Ferguson, there was pressure building to do something about this program because people were saying, what is this? Is this the US? Oh, yes, it is the US. Okay. So they made some cosmetic changes that prevented some limited amount of equipment, tanks with tracks, for example. Trump came in, reversed that agreement, that change. Biden says he's going to reverse the Trump reversal. And we're supposed to then, applaud him for being progressive. No, we say, shut down the whole program. Shut down 1033. And we're asking people to go to our site to sign that petition, but also to educate people on that program. The Israeli training of police forces by the training of police forces by the Israeli Defense Force. The existence of fusion centers. The repressive apparatus in this country that's here to have its full weight being directed at any political opposition in this country. So yes, we've got to raise up this issue of police militarization, but we have to link it always to the overall nature of this state.
Joe, you wanted to add something? You need to unmute.
Just a little bit on that. I encourage people to go to the Black Alliance for Peace website and sign the petition on 1033 and another petition on Afghanistan. But, another piece of the whole war at home was the attacks that came down on Muslims. Many people don't know, and UNAC was kind of formed around getting that link together. But many people don't know that there are special prisons for Muslims in the United States. They're called CMUs, Communication Management Units, where hundreds of Muslims are in these prisons in very harsh conditions. And part of it is based upon nothing that they did, but things that the FBI set up and tried to entrap them and get them to make comments and so forth. And this all was a danger in terms of the question that just happened about the repressive apparatus that we saw very, very early in terms of freedom of speech in the United States. They were going after these people for saying things. For instance, there was a man in the community I live in, who was in my local peace group, who was the head chaplain in the prison systems. He was a Muslim. He had worked there for 25 years. And he made the statement, well, if you want to end people attacking the United States, you got to change the international policy of the United States. He immediately lost his job. They tried to put him in prison, and they've done this with many, many others. And so just saying something can be a problem. But now we're seeing this again. A lot of liberals and a lot of Democrats were applauding the fact that, you know, certain websites were taken down and certain Twitter accounts were taken down. But, you know, ours have been taken down in that same thing. Our local group, Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, when I wrote something about Palestine, we lost our Facebook site over that. Other organizations, international organizations and others locally, Facebook and Twitter have been denying them. We talk about neoliberalism, and part of that is privatization, but they're privatizing free speech. We used to be able to go to the town square and talk, and if they didn't like what we said and they arrested us, we'd go to the city council and argue, and they might do nothing, but we had some place to go to. But now everything is in malls, or everything is on privately owned platforms like Facebook and Twitter and others, and they can do whatever they want, and there are no laws. This is a real danger for our movement, because we have no control over the mass media. Social media has been one of the only ways that we do, and they're really trying to crack down on our free speech, and it's something the movement has to take into consideration.
Great, thank you. And then I do also just want to add to that, you know, people in cities across the country have been working to get their city councils to ban the use of facial recognition technology. I think out in Oakland, they were able to ban these expos, these like weapons security state expos that were occurring out there. There's efforts around the country to get community control over the police. And you can check out the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, NAARPR.org, that has tools and information about community control of police. So there's lots of ways that we, you know, it feels like a big daunting program, but starting locally and organizing to change the policies in your community is one way to have an impact. So that's, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions. I really appreciate everybody who sent questions in. There were some really excellent ones, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. I'd like to turn this over now back to Gabriel from COSI-Venezuela and Bahman Azad from the U.S. Peace Council to close us out. And thank you to all the panelists. It's been a real pleasure to be with you today. So Bahman and Gabriel.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for supporting this, for moderating the Q&A session. We say that there are so many questions about the situation in the United States. There are lots of different assessments and proposals. We think that what comes clear from today's discussion is that we need to keep building a world of peace, solidarity, and social justice. We are certain that the efforts made by US-based organizations must sooner or later lead to the achievement of a better world and country in which each of the rights of the US population can be recognized and exercised, so we could overcome all of the inequalities that exist in the United States. We find it very useful to hear from each and every one of you. All of your presentations and proposals were so useful to us. On behalf of the Venezuelan people and COSI as an organization, I wish to give heartfelt thanks to each of the panelists who had the opportunity to share their opinions today. As participants, we've had about 100 people participating live in this activity today. So I think we can say it was a success, and we should continue to have these kinds of initiatives and activities, and we will move forward with our plan of specialized webinars on each of these topics. This is part of the work that our organizations should carry out. Now, Bahman, I'll let you have the final word to close out the webinar.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, everybody, for your profound presentations. As I said at the beginning, we're dealing with a very confusing, at the same time, a new situation. And a lot of propaganda is going on all over the place that can be misleading. And it is important that we keep sharp focus on the main issues that are involved here. And one of the key elements that we at the Peace Council have always pushed for is that anti-imperialist orientation of the movement that has to be emphasized, because unless we understand the nature of the beast, we will not be able to confront it. So I think you heard it from all of the speakers, folks. It's time to roll up our sleeves, join some kind of movement, and try to create the force that can push back all these anti-human agendas that are going on right now, not only in the United States, but around the world. So I thank you all for making this possible, and I especially thank Comrade Gabrielle and COSI for helping us put this together and working together on this one, and we are planning to have many more of these along the way in 2021. Thank you very much.
And let's thank our translators too, because they had to talk the whole 2 hours. So thank you for translating. They volunteered.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias a todos. Muchas gracias a las traductoras.
Yes, thank you to the interpreters as well. Thank you.
Thank you.